Very shortly, keep your eyes out the left hand side, we're going to see Lochleven Castle, only just going to be able to make it out in the gloom. It's where Mary Queen of Scots was held captive after the Battle of Carbery, when her son was crowned in place of her. In 1541, sorry, King James V was fighting Uncle Henry. You know who Uncle Henry is, don't you? It's Henry VIII. King James of Scotland, his uncle was Henry VIII. They're fighting over, Henry wanted James to join the new Protestant Reformation, of course, but James was happy remaining Catholic. They met at Solway Moss. There was about 20 Scots died and about 6 English died at the battle. It wasn't a real battle, it was a standoff, you know, a growling match if you want. Of course, the two sides went their separate ways. A few days later, immediately, the other Mormaers take Lullach, who was Melcola. I'll get myself mixed up here, I'm on with too many males. Mulvea, right. Mulvea, his stepson, Lullach, was taken to Scone, and he was crowned Ard Ri Analapa. Now, poor Lullach, he ended up with the name the Simpleton for all of time because of what he done next. He is said to have wandered into the camp of Melcolum seeking peace and was never ever seen again. In other words, he wandered in, they've killed him. The following year in 1058, Melcolum crowns himself not Ard Ri Analapa, but actually High King of Scotland. Aww. Another one of the tour buses here, so trying to cut me up. A wee second here, got to concentrate the driving. Yeah, so the following year, Melcolum crowns himself High King of Scotland. It's one of these transitional periods that I've been telling you about all day long. It's the end of the Celtic era. Mulvea was the last of the true Celtic kings. He was replaced by the first of the feudalistic kings of Scotland, because Malcolm had grown up in a feudalistic society in England. It didn't all happen overnight, but it happened over, well, the next couple of centuries. We lost the old Celtic kingdom and became the feudalistic kingdom of Scotland. Anybody tell me who I was talking about, by the way? I used the Gaelic names. Duncan the First, Malcolm the Third, and Macbeth. That's the true story of Macbeth, or at best that we can put it together. That's better. Right. Yeah, there's not very much information known about that point in history, but it's an interesting little story. Why did William Shakespeare write all of those lines? It's quite simple. Malcolm Canmore and his ancestors included the king, King James, who was king at during the time of William Shakespeare. If Shakespeare had written the truth and actually said it was King James's ancestors who had been the regicidal usurpers, James would have, how would you put this, not be best pleased, and in true Royal Stuart tradition may well have lopped off old Shakey's head. He would have been shaken, wouldn't he? Anyway, but no, Shakespeare probably chose to write it the other way round, just to please the king rather than telling the truth. He was a story writer, he could get away with whatever he wanted. It was quite obvious, isn't it? Have we passed junction 7 yet? Or junction 6 actually is the on. Let's just get my bearings where I am here. Yeah, okay, junction 6. Very shortly, keep your eyes out the left hand side. We're going to see Lochleven Castle. Only just going to be able to make it out in the gloom. It's where Mary Queen of Scots was held captive after the Battle of Carbery, when her son was crowned in place of her. In 1541, sorry, King James V was fighting Uncle Henry. You know who Uncle Henry is, don't you? It's Henry VIII. King James of Scotland. His uncle was Henry VIII. They're fighting over. Henry wanted James to join the new Protestant Reformation, of course, but James was happy remaining Catholic. They met at Solway Moss. There was about 20 Scots died and about 6 English died at the battle. It wasn't a real battle, it was a standoff, you know, a growling match if you want. Of course, the two sides went their separate ways. A few days later, James was dead. It was thought that he drank tainted water and it killed him. So it was typhoid or something like that. Anyway, the infant, about 3-year-old Mary, she was now the monarch, Mary, Queen of the Scots, not Queen of Scotland. None of our monarchs were King or Queen of Scotland. There, the Lochleven Castle, you can just make it out in the globe there on the island. It's Queen or King of the people, not of the land. Remember I told you, the land has no possession, is not a possession, it's not owned by anybody. Anyway, Mary is now Queen. Now, Uncle Henry, he decides he can make good this arrangement, and he arranges with some of the Scottish lords that Mary should marry his son Edward, and that way, well, in his eyes, eventually Scotland would just, after all these centuries of warfare between the two countries over this very matter, the ascension of Scotland would just naturally fall to his son. And a lot of the Scottish nobles were in agreement with that. A union of the country is fine, it's long overdue. But some of the other Scottish nobles, they stole Mary away and they took her to France where Mary grew up. This created a succession of wars known as the Rough Wooing, where Henry sent up the Duke of Hertford to try and force the Scots to hand over Mary and to allow the marriage to take place. Hertford was a real vandal. He damaged and destroyed many of the beautiful castles around Scotland. Anyway, Mary grew up in the court of the King and Queen of France alongside Francois the Dauphin, that means Francis the King of France, the Prince of France. The two of them were about the same age. They grew up side by side. They grew up to fall in love with each other, quite rightly so, of course that would happen. They got married, 1558 they got married. It was about the same year Elizabeth I was crowned Queen of England. Mary married Francois. Now, Francois was not the strongest of boys. Whilst jousting, he fell off the horse, he broke an inner ear bone, it turned infectious, and shortly after he was dead. Mary was only allowed to be Queen Consort. She was not allowed to be the Queen of France. She very quickly grew tired of that. By 1560 she was on her way back to Scotland, her own country. Now she'd sent word ahead, but she was about 2 weeks early when she arrived here. Nobody knew whose ship it was sailing into Leith Docks, or New Haven Harbour, sorry, it would have been back then. And she had to fire her own 21-gun salute, signifying that a royal was present. Of course, they hurried down from Holyrood Palace with all the pomp and ceremony, brought Mary back up and instated her in Holyrood Palace. Now, the country that Mary had left behind had been a Catholic country. She had arrived home to a completely new Protestant country. Mary herself had been brought up in Catholic France. She was a practicing Catholic. Now, this absolutely outraged the Presbyterian minister, John Knox. He spoke out against Mary. Mary wanted to have him executed, but she was advised it's really not the best political climate to do something like that under. So John Knox was left to, well, make all the noise he wanted. He was constantly speaking against Mary in all sorts of ways. He was outraged that she was holding private Catholic, had her own private Catholic chapel inside Holyrood Palace. But Mary's cousin, the Earl of Mar, he had been a Catholic and a turned Protestant, and he said, what I'll do is I'll get Mary and I will teach her what she needs to know about the new faith. Okay, it's agreed. So that's that. Everything seems to be settled down at this point. Now, eventually, it's decided it's time. This was about 3 or 4 years later. It's time that Mary had a child. Mary had a child. They had to find the right blood. That was what was most important. They wanted to keep the Stuart bloodline as pure as they possibly could. So they looked around and they found Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Man was a waste of time, a waste of space. He was a drinker, he was a gambler, a womanizer, a whole lot of other things, but he was also the correct blood group, the correct royal bloodline. Darnley could not believe his luck. He was a stupid, impetuous boy, nowhere near in line for the throne, and yet he was about to become King of Scotland, King of the country he wanted to rule over his own country. Now, the marriage was arranged, they got married. Mary was not stupid, she only allowed Henry to become king consort at a time when a husband owned his wife. Mary held, well, she ruled over her husband. That must have made Darnley absolutely livid. He had no power whatsoever. But anyway, eventually Mary became pregnant. She was about 6-7 months pregnant. She's in Holyrood Palace. She's entertaining with her staff, locked in her own private chambers. Darnley's up on the high street, or should I say, yeah, up on the high street, that's right, getting drunk with his friends. When they put it into Darnley's mind that the child that Mary's carrying, it's not yours, it's that little David Rizzio. David Rizzio was Mary's private secretary, an effeminate little Italian man that would have done no harm to anybody. It's that David Rizzio as he kept saying it's his. Eventually, Darnley, he was absolutely livid. He charged down to the palace, broke in to Mary's private apartments. Mary tried to protect David Rizzio. She hid him behind her big skirts. But of course, Mary, for her troubles, got a pistol stuck right in her ribs. David was pulled from behind her, dragged into the adjoining corridor, where he was brutally stabbed 37 times. If you visit the palace to this day, you can still see the bloodstain on the back step. And if the bloodstain isn't there, you can ask them and they'll put some more tomato sauce down for you. But anyway, Mary's livid with Darnley. She sends him away. Get out of Edinburgh, get well out of my sight. She has her child, James, in Edinburgh Castle. In fact, it's the windows with the gold leaf above them you're looking at on the front face of Edinburgh Castle. Shortly after James is born, he's transferred through to Stirling Castle. It's much safer through there. And Mary commutes. Now, Mary goes down to the Borders at this time. She has business down there, but she has a friend down there, one James Hepburn, not James Hepburn, too many names in this story to remember them all. Lord Bothwell. Sorry, did somebody shout that out there? Bothwell, that's good enough. He was Lord Bothwell. Anyway, Bothwell had been a commander in the Navy, and he had been a friend of Mary and Francois at the French court. He'd been injured in a battle with the Borders Reivers. The Reivers were kind of a lawless sect that ruled over the Borders, and he'd been injured. Mary travelled 4 long hours across the mountains and moorlands of the Borders to visit him, and she travelled 4 long, hard hours back again to Jedburgh. When she got back, she was exhausted. In fact, she became very ill, too ill to even eat. Her servants had to feed her a substance made of sugar and fruit, kind of boiled, heated up, just to keep her strength up. They called it "My Lady is Ill." That's the English, but in French it comes out as marmalade, said to be the origins of the preserve. But anyway, Mary recovered. She came back up to Edinburgh. She allowed her husband to come back, but he was only to live in Kirkafield, which was a house belonging to a friend of theirs right on the edge of the city wall. Mary would visit him, he was not to come and visit her. A short time had passed. Mary was down visiting her husband. She had a wedding to attend. One of her servants was getting married at Holyrood. She left Darnley and went down to the wedding. A few hours later, there was an almighty explosion heard in Edinburgh. Everybody rushed out to see it, and to find Kirkafield had been completely demolished by one big explosion. Now, Darnley had not been killed in the explosion. They found him outside, naked and strangled. Now, Mary did not mourn her husband at all. In fact, she was letting it be known that she liked Lord Bothwell instead, and the Ainsley Tavern document was signed, whereas some of the lords and clergymen of Scotland accepted that Mary wanted to marry Lord Bothwell. Now, Mary headed through to Stirling Castle to see her son. Unbeknown to her, it was going to be the last time she ever saw him. On the way back, she met Bothwell at Linlithgow Palace, where Mary had actually been born. It's in between the two, Edinburgh and Stirling. And there, Bothwell advised her that it was not safe in Edinburgh for her. There were people plotting and that she should come with him. That Bothwell always had his own standing army of about 5 to about 800 heavily armed, well-seasoned professional soldiers with him. Come with me. They headed down the east coast of Scotland to Dunbar Castle, where they spent about 10 days to a fortnight down there. On the return, of course, Mary, still not mourning the loss of her husband, she declared she wanted to get married to Bothwell. Now, immediately fingers started pointing, saying, Bothwell, he's the one that killed Darnley. A trial was demanded, but Mary says if you want a trial, it happens now. Try not to give them any time to amass any evidence. At the trial, now there are 3 verdicts in Scotland. Guilty, take you out and string you up. Not guilty, well, you're off, you're free, off you go. But in Scotland we also have not proven. Usually means we know you've done it, but we can't prove it. But in Darnley, Bothwell's case, we know you've done it, but nobody's got the nerve to point the finger at you, knowing you've got that standing army standing out there in the high street waiting for you. He got let off. It created a split in the country. Before Mary knew it, she was facing half the nobles of Scotland at a place called Carberry Hill, just outside Edinburgh. Mary chose to take terms. She says, if you allow Bothwell to leave the field, I will surrender. She felt she was her monarch. There was nothing they could do to her as far as Mary was concerned. How wrong was she? Bothwell was allowed to leave the field. He escaped to Denmark. Now, he had been in a previous relationship in Denmark where he had been a bit of a cad. He had used a Danish noblewoman for her money, basically. Had not been good to her. When he escaped back to Denmark, he was immediately captured and arrested and taken to a very notorious Danish jail where he was tortured to insanity. Tortured till he was insane. He was taken out, locked into a little cage in the streets, and he became a curio for children to throw things at. Now, yeah, everything's all lit up, I'm just noticing that as well. Anyway, Where was I? Right, yep. So back to Mary. Mary's arrested. She's taken to Lochleven Castle that we passed just a few miles back up the road there. She's forced to abdicate in place of her own infant son. She has to do it. James is crowned at Greyfriars in Stirling, the only surviving church where a king has been crowned in Scotland. He's crowned there. Mary's locked in Lochleven for about a year. She eventually manages to woo Walter Douglas, the keeper at the castle, and he allows her to escape. She heads over to the west, where the Hamilton family, her big supporters, they are able to amass an army for her, and she meets, of all people, remember the Earl of Mar, the one that took her under his wing to teach her about being a Protestant. It's him that she faces in battle. He is fighting that Mary's son should keep the crown. She is fighting that she should get her own crown back again. What a terrible position to put that girl in. She's still just a young girl at this point as well. Still just a young girl. A terrible thing to do to her. She loses the battle. It's White Riggs, I think. I can't remember quite the name of it. White Riggs, I think it was called, south of Glasgow. She escapes into England to her cousin Elizabeth. The first thing, she wants an audience with Elizabeth, but Elizabeth won't speak to her. The first thing Elizabeth wants to know is what happened to my cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, because he was her cousin too. There was no answer to that. Mary ended up spending 18 long years in captivity. She was under house arrest. She had her servants, she had her clothes, she had the best of food, best of accommodation. She wanted for nothing, but she was under house arrest. Elizabeth would never ever give her the time of day that she needed. Till eventually, Mary got herself stupidly involved in a plot to overthrow Elizabeth. Elizabeth signed Mary's death warrant. 1587, I'm forgetting the date. Mary was taken out at dawn in Fotheringay Castle, where she was beheaded. Leaving her son, well, he hadn't seen her mother since he was about 10 months old, a year old. Now, in Mary's lifetime, she never done anything wrong. It was all fate was against her. Poor girl. Fate was not on her side ever. In reality, if the Catholic Church actually recognised Mary as the true Queen of England, because Elizabeth had been born to one of the later wives of Henry VIII. Mary was related through Henry's, I think it was his first wife. And so the Catholic eyes, it was Mary that should have been the Queen of England. But actually, in the Protestant eyes, of course, it was Elizabeth. She was the correct Queen. Mary should have been the Queen of Scotland, outright Queen of Scotland. In fact, she should have been the Queen of the three kingdoms, Scotland, England and Ireland. I don't know why Wales is never mentioned in that. And the Queen Consort of France, one of the most powerful people in Europe she would be, but by sheer fate she lost it all, and her son, and everything. One of Scotland's great tragedies, the story of Mary, Queen of Scots. good, most of them are going through Dalmeny. Where's my dark glasses and white stick? Don't wait for them, they'll only get through. About 30 cars latched onto the back of me saying, oh look, he knows how to get through, follow him. Oh, right. But how does it go? I've met my nemesis. Easy when you know how. Oh, come on. You're not allowed to park there. You really aren't. Is there a pizza delivery boy or something? Oh yeah. I've done this 100 times. See, what they've got to realise is if they keep coming through, they'll create a jam and then nobody will get moving in either direction. And can they not see right now that nothing's moving? That's we're out of it now. Okay, as you can see, the bridge is actually, we've only lit up part of it at the moment. The lights have maybe failed here, but the main part's nice and lit up. The water's reasonably calm. If you look carefully, you'll see there's a lovely reflection down there. Here's me without my tripod. I'll have to stick two tourists together. See how I got on. Yeah, you get reasonably secure, you know, just on the pillars there of the fence if you need something just to keep your camera nice and secure. 10 minutes, guys.